we're going to see an environment where the level of service and quality because of the lack of labor is going to become a real issue for businesses. And if we're going to see a massive manufacturing renaissance back in the United States, we're going to have to figure out this labor situation, but I'm not very hopeful.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
And welcome back. This is part 2 of our special interview with Craig Fuller. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we recommend that you do so. Now, let's dive in. That seems to have been very prominent this year. I mean, we hear about strikes and then the threat of strikes from UPS and now the threat of strikes at the UAW in Detroit.
Going to be right behind that. That's going to be another one. The unions seem to be emboldened right now and they're going to town. And I think it's really a shame because their average wages right now are higher than the average person are getting. And they're still pushing. And
yeah, look, I think it's just let's just take the questions of why or the frustrations we have as businesses and the lack of continuity and certainly unions create a lot of risks that I think most businesses don't want to deal with or any business wants to deal with. The reality is that this is a demographic problem. The unions like to take credit for all the advances that they've made in terms of higher wages and benefits for their employees, and those things are true. But a lot of this is grounded in the fact that we have a real demographic problem for the types of jobs that unions tend to be highly exposed to. So we look at a lot of blue collar jobs. You mentioned UPS. We can't forget what the Teamsters did to Yellow. Now, Yellow did a lot of it itself, but certainly the Teamsters put the nail on top of the coffin. They provided no support there. We've seen the airline unions have also gotten an enormous amount of concessions and continue to put pressure. I think this is going to be a reality that we're going to live with. I have grew up in a time when deunionization or unions played a far lesser role in the economy. But you hear about the stories in the 60s and 70s where labor had an enormous amount of power. And I think that's the direction our economy is going in. Like it or not, it's just a reality of economics. When you have a supply and demand mismatch, which is we have a low amount of available labor for the types of jobs that tend to be unionized, it's going to give the unions an enormous amount of power. And I think the labor story is not going to be done in a year. I think we're going to live with this situation for potentially a decade. And if you don't like it, the only thing that's going to really change that variable is an immigration policy because Americans just aren't having the kids at the frequency that we used to. We have other stuff going on in our lives. And that's the only thing that can change the labor equation right now is really more immigration, which is not something that's going to happen in Washington.
Well, with the current scenario too, with so many, as they would say, undocumented, folks coming in or illegals or however you want to label it, I think that it's just a matter of time before there's going to be some legislation to allow for some of these folks that have come in, non-U.S. citizens that are going to be allowed to work. And in my opinion, now this is just a personal opinion here, is I would love to see a work program or whatever, allowing folks to go ahead and work without, a pathway to citizenship. And unfortunately, the politics get in there. But the thing that's so frustrating to businesses right now, and I'd love to hear your comments on this, is that businesses are struggling to find people to work. And I mean, it's crazy. And it's a scenario where, even if you get somebody that is willing to take a job, then their work ethic is quite frankly horrible. So what do you see happening with this scenario of the current situation we have? We've got literally millions of, I think it's now we're up to like 4.5 million people who have come across the border. And they're all over the country now, and definitely in the Southwest and whatnot. What do you see from your perspective? Do you see any impact on the labor markets and on some of the things like, some of these open positions and whatnot for some of these frontline positions, I guess? In a world driven by innovation and global connectivity, there's one name that stands out above the rest: Schultz Trade Law. With over 30 years providing legal and consulting services to Fortune 500 companies, Schultz Trade Law knows the challenges that businesses face in navigating the complex landscape of international trade. The legal and regulatory hurdles can impede growth and drain resources. But fear not, because Schultz Trade Law has the solution. At Schultz Trade Law, they've harnessed their vast knowledge of real-world trade challenges and legal expertise to create a seamless experience for businesses engaged in international trade. Their team of legal experts know how to streamline import and export compliance, resolve trade disputes, and optimize global supply chain operations. Learn more at schultztradelaw.com, where legal expertise leads the way to global success.
There's the gray economy, we'll call it, which is people working for cash and sort of working off the grid, certainly exist. And look, I'm going to take an economic point of view. I'm not going to get into the politics of whether, immigration should happen, because I think we just, it isn't productive. From an economic point of view, my hope for that is that those 4.5 million or 5 or how many folks are here had the opportunity to participate in our economy. They had the opportunity to pay taxes. They had the opportunity to make a proper wage and support their families, and have the proper path to buy homes and other things that would make them productive citizens into our economy. It is ironic that because of our policies, we've decided that having a path to become productive and pay taxes means that if you support any of those kinds of policies, from a political standpoint, it becomes a lightning rod. It looks like you're endorsing this activity. It's just economics, in my opinion. So I would, the labor force is incredibly tight. Unions are going to have an enormous amount of power as long as we have a demographic challenge of young. If you just look at the ages of people, we're in a part of the sort of demographic cycle where this generation has some of the smallest number of children that are sort of coming of age, working age. And it's going to be another decade before we sort of have sort of an emergence of a new generation, which is one of the largest generations in American history. So we're in a situation, frankly, that we're facing significant demographic challenges. And the only way to make it productive, frankly, is to allow those folks to work. It's just the problem in Washington is that nobody really cares about these issues. They're all focused on sort of this infighting between themselves. I mean, let's take all the political BS. They spend so much time fighting one another, investigating one another, impeaching one another. Like, regardless of whether that stuff is grounded, I would rather them focus on things that are actually quite important to the average American, and get busy doing that work, which I don't think they will. And so, unfortunately, the unions are going to have more power, and we're going to see an environment where the level of service and quality, because of the lack of labor, is going to become a real issue for businesses. And if we're going to see a massive manufacturing renaissance back in the United States, we're going to have to figure out this labor situation. But I'm not very hopeful.
Well, I will say that the thing that bothers me on the congressional side of things, one of the things that bothers me with all this infighting back and forth, as well as, and again, administration and policies, the U.S., for the first time in modern history, is no longer the top exporter of grain. And, there's been so much effort on trying to come up with trade deals that are so focused on green energies and labor rates and things of that nature, and they're not getting the trade deals done with different countries. But other countries are out there, and guess what? Brazil has stepped up and usurped the U.S. in supplying grains. Well, this is a case where they have now earned a new customer that used to be more of a U.S. customer. And guess what? U.S. gets out there. You've got to try and get those people back. They won't just automatically come back. They're going to be happy with, if Brazil's satisfying with a good product and a good rate and good cycle times, U.S. is now competitively have shot themselves in the foot. So that's one of those where for every $1 billion of trade, it equates to 10,000 jobs. We're losing out on that very thing. And it just, man, I tell you what, it just gets me worked up like a wet hen at times.
It's so deconstructive. And if you think about, getting a little bit political, but you think about from 1980 under Ronald Reagan and all the way in George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush, really that whole period was really one of the most remarkable points in history of global trade really fostering, and policies were put to advance American interest economic. That was the most important thing. And I think what's happened really in the last, and it's both administrations or both sides of the aisle that have done this, is they've sort of had this very insular focus. You pointed out that Biden kept Trump's tariffs in place. Biden effectively is continuing to execute Trump's policies, which are deconstructive in many ways to trade, and kept them in place. He just does it without talking about it, unlike Donald Trump, which made sure you knew what was going to happen. And I think that really hurts America. And you point out a really important fact, which is about, I believe in climate change. For the record, I've been to China and seen places without proper environmental regulations, just how dirty the water is. You start to question what you're eating, what you're drinking, what you're breathing. We don't want that in America. But we have gone in some sort of idealistic fashion that we can decarbonize the economy. It's just not grounded in economics or science. And so because of that, you think about how remarkable fossil fuels have been to our lives. You think about the fact that climate deaths are down by 99.9% in the last 100 years. We talk about Texas. Think about Galveston with the hurricane that hit Galveston in 1906 and the fires and the tornadoes. The climate is certainly in flux, if you will, and has an enormous amount of changes and constantly changing. But the reality is that fossil fuels have brought us the technologies and the ability to deal with those issues. And I think it's sort of foolish to sort of think that we can decarbonize the economy and still enjoy the lifestyle that we enjoy. And I think some of the public policy that's been so focused on this sort of idealistic element misses the importance of having a strong, robust economy, which is incredibly important to the well-being. And my belief is that if we have a strong economy, and you see this, as economies prosper, even in China, they start to care more about the environment. As they develop, they start to invest in technologies and resources that take better care of the environment. And so I personally believe if we had an economic first policy on all of the decisions we made, that humans will naturally take better care of the environment. And that's what we're seeing right now. And I think, unfortunately, we've seen it in Europe. Europe has shot themselves in the foot economically because of their sort of idealism around environmental policy, that frankly, there's a lot of concern that may happen in the U.S.
Well, the scenario there is, and this has been one of my push on this, it's renewable energies are fine, but they have not been able, none of the renewable energies can generate the power needed to satisfy the demand at the efficiency or cost effectiveness of, the fossil fuels. There is one
renewable energy, and that is nuclear.
Yeah, nuclear is fantastic. That's probably the most efficient. It's fantastic. When's the last time we've had a nuclear reactor built?
There's one, I believe, in Alabama or Georgia that has come online in the last couple of months, or is in the. But I think it's like 1 in 20 years. It is insane how, and this is what has happened in Germany. It's sort of interesting to watch the French and Germany's story play out. Is that France, something like 60% of their energy comes from nuclear. And this is a country that we would view, or I would view, as fairly progressive in terms of its politics. But they have doubled down on nuclear, whereas Germany has done the opposite. And Germany now has turned on its coal plants because it doesn't have power. And it's being held hostage by the Russian story, or was threatened to be held hostage by it, because it had decommissioned most of its nuclear power infrastructure. This is a serious issue. And you mentioned decarbonization. The reality is decarbonization is unlikely to ever happen. And so what do we do to complement it? We need to find cleaner fuels. Well, natural gas, which we're flooded in it in the United States, is a much cleaner fuel than what coal or oil products are. And we should be doing everything. The problem is that is politically, if you went out and promoted, if you're a Democrat and you went out and promoted nat gas as an alternative, there are folks on the extreme environmental lobbies that would say you're selling out this economy for fossil fuels, and that's the real risk here. Is that, and look, it's in immigration, it's in energy, it's in decarbonization, it's all of these policies where we're fighting among each other, and we're not addressing real ways to really produce a vibrant economy.
Well, and I'm of the opinion it's like, okay, push the scenario for renewable, like the EVs now, the electrical vehicles, and all that. That sounds great, but you can't, in my opinion, you cannot just wipe out all of the existing petroleum scenarios and then replace it all with the EV scenario and expect everything to work. It's like, look, there ought to be a balance, because there are scenarios, and I'll give you a good example, where EVs just it's not a feasible option. Farmers, those tractors may sit for a long time, but then when they got to fire them up and get the fields ready in the springtime, and they're plowing and disking and all that, and then seeding and doing all the things they have to do, and then cultivating those crops. You'll be out in the middle of a field, and if your batteries run down, it's like, well, my barn's way off or whatever. What am I going to do? And there's not an easy swap out there. And that's a heavy equipment type scenario. And I know that the government was pushing, like, manufacturers like John Deere and others to come up with an EV solution. Farmers are looking at them going, I'm not buying that, because when, if I'm out in the middle of somewhere, it shuts down. That's a great example to me where an EV is not the solution for everybody. It's, you got to keep going.
And you look at and again, I'm not, just to be clear, I believe in climate change, and I believe in protecting our environment. But you look at what fossil fuels have done to enable the United States to win the agriculture race. It's one of the reasons we have so much surplus in food, is because fossil fueled vehicles have enabled us farmers to become 100 times more productive than done by hand. And so we think about that. We have to be very careful of these policies. As you mentioned, it's not just farming, it's also trucking. Look at the most successful EV manufacturer in the world, arguably the most successful technology in automotive period, the company, Tesla I'm talking about. They've produced something like 40 Tesla semis. And Elon Musk came out in 2017 and predicted, or made a boast, that he was going to have 200,000 of these Tesla semis on the road by 2022. And they produced 40. Here's the crazy part, is we count them on FreightWaves. We've seen at least 15 of those Tesla semis being towed somewhere around the country. So if Tesla can't get this right, if the most successful electronic EV manufacturer in the world cannot figure out how to make a semi work in the field, in the wild, there is no hope that the other manufacturers are going to get there quickly. And I think that's the problem, is policy is leading with these idealistic concepts. And sometimes you need that. We want cleaner air, we want cleaner water. Some of the environmental movement that took place in the 60s and 70s have enabled that. But when you talk about decarbonization, what they're actually not understanding is that so much of the reason we have these vehicles, and they're heavy and they require an enormous amount of energy consumption, is because the mission itself that is built for requires that energy consumption anyways. And so there's a lot of things that need to happen, but it's frankly, it's going to be a generational challenge that we're just going to have to contend with.
Well, and that the recharging on the EVs with those, especially the trucks. I know that there was a trucking company that was putting wanted to put a hub in the Chicago area, and they were trying to run the EVs, and they put in, what they wanted as far as charging, all that. And I think the utility company said, "Is this a joke? Are you kidding me? Because what you're going to need is I think it came back, they were going to need something along the lines of 8 gigawatts to be able to charge those trucks." And they said, "We're only putting out 5 gigawatts now." It's like, you'd kill us, and it's like, you expand that across everything, and it's like everybody has a problem with it.
Well, it was Warner. I think what you're talking about is it was a suburb of Chicago. It was Warner Enterprises. I think it was 30 trucks, and they wanted to put in supercharging stations to charge their EVs. And that's right. It was basically more power than the entire town, the utility had produced, to your point. And you think about that, that's 30 trucks. I mean, we're talking about, an industry with 3.5 million. So this is not going to be solved. And I think if you think about what all this means, it means that these big issues, whether it's climate change and decarbonization, we have to find solutions that enable us to continue to have a productive economy that allows the technology to catch up before we can sort of force it all at once. And I think this is trade policy as well. Like, we want North American manufacturing. One of the sort of ironies of Donald Trump's trade policies that he put back in 2018 is that he implemented them, and there really wasn't a lot of movement for American reshoring. Like, you saw companies leave China and move to places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, but there wasn't really a movement back to North America. And what's caused that is really China's internal actions in a post-COVID environment, or we'll call it during COVID, the zero lockdowns and the geopolitical tensions, where the free market, the decision makers that run supply chains, made the decisions. They're going to look at places to source production like Colombia and Mexico closer to home, so they don't have to contend with that. And that's really what we need. We need vibrant free market policies that enable business leaders to make these decisions that are in their best interest and encourage those decisions, because eventually you get there. And I think the same thing is going to happen for decarbonization. I think over time, we will see technologies continue to catch up to allow us to achieve these goals, because if there's a demand, if there's a market for it, that will eventually get there. And I think if the market is allowed to do that, we'll get there. Policy is a blunt instrument, and unfortunately, at times, has a lot of the people writing the policy don't understand the economics or the science, and at times can be really detrimental to our economic success.
Well, one of the things I've got a question for you is, of what you've seen, do you think it's interesting? It's like it's completely EV or nothing, right? I don't see any hybrids out there. I would think that, even like on these semis, would there be a hybrid situation that would be, viable? Once you got to have the power to get that heavy weight going. Once you got it going, maybe switching over all that. But I don't see any development of hybrid semis. Do you?
The problem that you have in the EV story around trucks is the weight. I mean, an equivalent battery operated truck, in terms of distance, is about 300. Take a 45,000 pound truck. We've seen this with Tesla. So Tesla issued trucks to Pepsi and Frito-Lay. Frito-Lay is a division of Pepsi. So think about what they were hauling. What we found in the story was anything within 100 miles radius, they could haul the cans, the big soda. It's gonna weigh out before it cubes out. So 45,000 pounds. They could complete that mission, but only within 100 miles of a charging station. The Frito-Lay, the chips, stuff that is going to cube out before it weighs out, was able to do the 300-mile distance. And just put that in perspective, a typical semi-truck, you'll have 100 to 150 gallons it can hold. And now we're seeing fuel economy get in the 8, 9, 10 miles per gallon. And so we're seeing a situation where a truck should be able to go 1,000 to 1,200 miles on a single tank or two tanks of fuel. And what we're seeing is that the distance that is required for a lot of these missions are just much further than what EV is capable of. So, and the issue is that you end up with 16,000 pounds for batteries alone versus an equivalent 6,000 for an internal combustion diesel engine. So we're sitting in a situation where we have the physics of batteries, and the weight is a major issue for trucking companies. You don't get the distance you need. You have the lack of dependability. We haven't run through enough cycles to see how these vehicles are going to perform in the wild. The ones that have been in the wild, the Tesla Semi, have consistently, from reports, had to be moved in for maintenance issues that they've broken down or had other issues that have to be dealt with. And so until this technology has had enough time in the wild to where we actually know what it's capable of, it's not capable of, it's just an infeasible set of policies that are going to trying to be achieved. And that's where California, I think, has made an enormous disservice to its own economy by outlawing internal combustion engines in 2035 and 2040. So we're seeing a situation where the policy and the sort of idealism of politicians doesn't match with the economic reality.
Well, and with that, I would say, let's step back here for a second. With all the different things we're talking about that impact supply chain, impact, consumer, behavior and all that. One of the things I guess I would say is folks need to really get involved with their, not only the representatives, both Senate and congressional, but, trade associations, especially on the trucking side, especially on, industry, make a point to listen to what's trying to be pushed so that you can look at it and say, look, some of these policies may be fun, but you've got to do it in balance. And that's what's essential, because it seems like some of these policies are pushing them, just like you said in California, they're pushing forward. And it's like, well, wait a minute. What is the impact? And before a policy goes into place or a legislative item comes into place, have the impact study done so that you can see what's this going to mean to my, my bottom line and my pocket, if you will, as an individual and all of that. So that.
But I don't know that they're overly concerned about that. I mean, I think there's some political expedience of, hey, I get to become a hero for decommissioning a nuclear plant. Like they did in California. And I think what is challenging is that there's a desire to be popular and elected that is outweighing the economic vibrancy that our economy should have. Having said that, America is blessed with massive amounts of resources and energy resources and food resources. We truly are the country of the next century. I mean, it has felt like America has lost its way versus China and, go back 30 years ago versus Japan. It's just not the case. I mean, our economy is incredibly robust and will continue to be. And this will be, in spite of our issues, I'm incredibly bullish on America and what this means.
Well, it's America's economy is like that shiny new penny. It's like it's fantastic to have, and it is still, it's. In traveling around the world, it's still fantastic to be here. So we appreciate your listenership here again. And as we're looking at this and we wrap things up, we really hope that you will make comments for what Craig has given us today. And with that, Lalo, anything you need to add?
No, that's just it. I just want to give Craig the opportunity to wrap up, I guess, and because I know we need to go.
Yeah, you can find me. You can find our content on FreightWaves.com, or you can find me personally on Twitter, or X, we call it now, at Freight Alley. So look forward to connecting with you. That's the best way to reach me.
Right, and we'll have all that on the show notes. Thank you, Craig. Thanks for joining us.
Appreciate you guys. Take care.
Thanks.
Yes, you too.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.